They didn't whisper it. They published it. They wrote it into books, articles, and references the world trusted. Oxford itself, the institution many call the guardian of the English language, once dismissed Filipino as a broken tongue. Imagine that, an entire people's language reduced to an insult, printed and spread as if it were fact. It started with colonial-era scholars who couldn't see beyond their own superiority. They observed the way Filipinos spoke, blending native words with English, Spanish, and other influences, and instead of calling it rich, they labeled it improper. Instead of evolving, they called it damaged. The word Filipino became, in their eyes, a contradiction, a nation proud of its culture but mocked for its language. And the Oxford Dictionary, seen as the highest authority, sealed the insult by classifying Filipino English as something less than standard. For decades, this judgment became a scar. Students grew up being told their way of speaking wasn't good enough. Workers abroad were laughed at for their accents. Even inside the Philippines, many began to believe the lie, that their English, their Filipino, even their Taglish was inferior. But history has a way of turning insults into weapons. What Oxford failed to understand was this: the Filipino language was never broken. It was alive, it was adaptive, and it was about to prove itself in a way the world couldn't ignore. The stage was being set for a moment when the world's so-called broken tongue would speak louder, clearer, and stronger than anyone expected. The stage was no longer just Oxford's library or dusty colonial classrooms. The Filipino voice had started to travel through classrooms, through books, through workers who carried their accents abroad. Every laugh, every sneer, every mocking remark was fuel. But what the world didn't see coming was how this so-called broken language was quietly building its power. In call centers across Manila, young Filipinos were learning to speak to the world. Customers from America, Britain, and Australia picked up their phones, expecting indifference, but instead, they were greeted with a clarity and warmth they never forgot. Some mocked at first. "Where are you from? Why do you sound different?" But then the same voices solved problems, calmed frustrations, and built trust. Oxford's definition hadn't changed yet, but reality was already rewriting the story. In global corporations, Filipino workers became prized not only for their English, but for their patience, empathy, and adaptability. The world's largest companies began quietly relying on voices they once dismissed. Meanwhile, in classrooms, Filipino students were proving themselves in debates and competitions abroad. At Harvard, Cambridge, and Tokyo, judges sat stunned as a speaker from Manila or Cebu or Davao stood at the podium and delivered arguments so sharp, so clear, that accents no longer mattered. What mattered was the mind behind the words. Slowly, what was once mocked as Taglish became celebrated as a skill. Switching between languages wasn't confusion, it was agility. The Filipino tongue could bend, adapt, and survive in ways Oxford never imagined. In fact, the very thing they called broken was proof of a strength no other nation possessed. And yet, the world still needed one undeniable moment, a stage, a voice, an event so powerful that the insult could never again be spoken with authority. That moment was closer than anyone realized. Because soon, the Filipino voice wasn't just going to answer phone calls or win debates or inspire in classrooms. It was going to step into the spotlight of history and stand face to face with Oxford itself. The stage was set. For centuries, Oxford had stood as the judge, the gatekeeper, the dictionary of truth. But now, the so-called broken language was walking into its house, not as a guest to be mocked, but as a challenger ready to speak. The Filipino protagonist stood at the heart of an international linguistic conference hosted by Oxford itself. Scholars from around the world filled the hall: British professors, American linguists, Japanese experts, German scholars, all waiting to hear what they assumed would be another minor voice from a small country. When he stepped to the podium, some smirked, a few whispered. The echoes of broken lingered in the air, but the Filipino did not bow his head this time. He lifted his gaze, his barong crisp under the lights, and began to speak. At first he spoke in English, fluent, clear, with a rhythm that carried authority. He told the story of how language is not chains, but rivers. They bend, they merge, they adapt. The audience listened politely, waiting for a flaw. But then he shifted. Without hesitation, he slipped into Filipino. The cadence changed. The hall filled with a sound that was musical, commanding, alive. Then came Spanish, then English again, then Taglish, fluid, natural, unstoppable. Every word stitched together into a story of survival, resilience, and brilliance. The scholars who once mocked now leaned forward, scribbling notes furiously. Oxford, the great guardian of language, was witnessing a truth it could no longer deny. The Filipino tongue wasn't broken. It was proof of evolution itself. He ended with words that silenced the room. Languages are not broken, they are alive. And if survival, adaptability, and unity are the measures of strength, then the Filipino language is one of the strongest in the world. The hall erupted, not in mockery, not in whispers, but in applause. Thunderous, echoing applause that shook the very walls of Oxford. Delegates rose to their feet. Some wiped tears. For the first time, Oxford wasn't the one defining Filipino. Filipino was defining itself. And from that day forward, the scar left by the word broken began to heal. Because the world had finally heard the truth. The Filipino voice had risen, and it could never again be silenced.